Odysseus and his men return to the island of Circe and bury their comrade, Elpenor, who had spoken to Odysseus from the underworld. Circe tells Odysseus that Odysseus and Odysseus alone, what trials await him on his journey. First, he and his men must sail by the Sirens in their irresistible song of temptation. Next, Odysseus will have to choose between sailing through a path of unavoidable clashing rocks or sail through a strait with two monsters. On one side, there is a six-headed horror named Scylla that will pluck men off the ship. And on the other side, the whirlpool monster named Charybdis that will swallow the entire ship. Lastly, they will come to an island of where the sun god's cattle graze, and must not under any circumstances harm the cattle. If they can do this, they will return home. But if not, then the best that could happen is Odysseus returns home alone, all shipmates lost, a broken man. Odysseus tells his men about the Sirens and Charybdis, but not Scylla. After escaping the Sirens, his men are navigating past Charybdis when Scylla snatches 6 of Odysseus' men off his ship. Odysseus and his men land on the island of the sun god's cattle, and Odysseus has his men swear an oath they will not harm the animals. The men, however, become stranded on the island due to an unfavorable wind and begin to starve. Odysseus' men elect to eat the sacred cattle, and as they finally leave the island, Zeus strikes the ship with a lightning bolt. All perish save Odysseus, who, clinging to debris, is swept back to Charybdis and must hang on to a fig tree to avoid being swallowed. The book ends with Odysseus drifting until he lands on the island of Calypso.
Welcome to Ascend the Great Books podcast. I'm Adam Minihan here, sitting with Deacon Harrison Garlick. Regardless of why you're here, maybe you love Homer, maybe you're a guy or gal who likes half bird, half woman, or maybe you're just a big fan of a good, delicious piece of beef. Regardless of why you are here, we are glad you are here to join us as we go through book 12 of the Odyssey in this year of Homer, The Cattle of the Sun. This is a very interesting book. It has been, the last 4 books have just been capturing of the imagination to the nth degree. I think it's just as I keep going, I'm reading this through the first time, I'm reading it and I'm like, okay, well, what else could possibly happen here? And then you go to the next chapter and you're like, what? Okay, no, okay, we got past the Cyclops, now what's going to happen? It's like, what? It's just one thing after another of interesting and definitely expanding your imagination, trials and tribulations that Odysseus and his men go through. Now, I will tell you, Deacon, that up until this point, I've given a lot of leeway for Odysseus's men. There's big guys who've been having, just getting eaten by the Cyclops. That's a bummer. You're going through this whole journey and, you just get eaten by the Cyclops. And then the next morning, another dude gets eaten by a Cyclops. That's a bummer. I got to tell you though, after this, reading this book, my level of tolerance for Odysseus's men, really caved.
Really?
You guys deserve all of this.
That's fascinating. I agree with you. I think that books 9 through 12 are probably some of the best literature in the Western canon. They're just fun, right? It's Odysseus retelling his story. He's playing the role of the bard in certain ways. And what's really fascinating,
you get the first person aspect is really crazy.
And, then there's a whole layers we've kind of been discussing of this is him retelling his story. Mm-hmm. How much of this do we actually lean into as being 100% honest? How much of this is him maybe, kind of cutting some corners? I think we're going to see some of that in book 12 too, where I'm highly suspicious of how he frames certain things. The other thing too, I'm interested in is your perspective as a first-time reader. When I read it the first time, and I've already lamented about this on the podcast, but I kind of think the Odyssey starts a bit slow. and it kind of builds, and like, then we have like, okay, Odysseus is finally, introduced, and then it's really not till book 9 where I felt like the narrative really picked up. But then 9 through 12 has almost every narrative in it that's famous from the Odyssey. I mean, even in this book, it's like, okay, well, we're just going to go from Sirens to Scylla to Charybdis to the cattle of the sun. Like all these narratives that are famous in the Odyssey are like rapid shot together. I mean, the whole thing about Sirens, most people who have never read the Odyssey know about Sirens. And that's not, is that even 100 lines? Right?
Right.
That's
I
one
know.
thing that's fascinating, is that so much of what the Odyssey is known for is packed into these 4 books.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's why I keep thinking, like, reading through this the first time, it's like, wow, okay, another big moment. Boom, another big moment. Boom, another big moment. It's like, okay, well, we're running out of big moments, it seems like. It's like,
Yeah.
when are we going to, in like the Iliad, it's like you get this climactic moments, and then like all of a sudden it's like this, like, oh, we're going off this weird story that, doesn't really pertain to what just happened in the last book. And it kind of like settles things down, and then it's like, boom, climactic again. That's not how this one seems to be going.
But I want to go back to what you said about the men. I find it really interesting that you lost your patience with the men, because I feel like this is the book that I really lost my patience with Odysseus.
Okay.
And I'm more sympathetic with his men. And so I'm interested to kind of flesh that out a bit.
Okay.
I do
Good.
agree. I do agree overall, there's a broken trust. I think what we see in book 12 is like whatever trust is actually still, whatever bond of trust still endures between Odysseus and his men, finally fractures in book 12, to the degree that it's interesting to me of how much that's even repairable, and how much is Odysseus even still leading this expedition.
Yes, I mean, especially in this day and age where honor is such a big deal, right? Hierarchy is such a big deal. You take an oath, your word means something, especially from somebody who is of a higher authority than yourself. So yeah, I'm anxious because like maybe I'm, again, this is my first time, so maybe I misread it, but I'm anxious to maybe push back.
No, I don't think you misread it. I think there's a dance here between Odysseus and his men, and it's just interesting to see what predilections people pick up on that causes them to actually like one or the other.
Yeah.
Right? But let's look into it. Let's actually get into book 12 here.
Okay.
So the cattle of the sun. So the first thing that we get in the narrative is the burial of Elpenor. Now, if you remember when we discussed book it's 11, correct? The House of the Dead. Yeah, the Kingdom of the Dead. Elpenor is the shade. Soul, again, maybe is a robust word, but is the shade that comes up to him and says, hey, you need to go back and you need to bury me. He fell off the roof, right? You need to go back and bury me. And the only thing I think I want to provide here is that the one thing about his ritual that stands out to me is that you need to plant a balanced ore aloft to crown his tomb. Right, so that's line, we're right here at the beginning, so that's like line 15 or so. So in Elpenor's burial, they're basically going to take this ore from the ship and they're going to stick it on top of the tomb, and that's like the sign of his tomb. And outside of that being a unique thing, I simply just want to draw attention because it's the same symbol that we see. The ore is the same thing that we saw when Tiresias told Odysseus in book 11 that he has to go on this like penitential journey. So even if Odysseus makes it home, once he gets home, he still has to go on this penitential journey. And remember, he has to like travel inland carrying this ore until people don't know what an ore is. Right? That's how far inland he has to get. They think it's a winnowing fan. So it's just interesting to me that we have this ore kicks off book 12. We've seen that there's an ore that supposedly is going to kick in at the end of the Odyssey as well. And so I'm just kind of flagging that motif because I think it's going to play out as we kind of move on.
Yeah, and I just flagged there that it just seemed like that they respected his wishes and they gave him the proper burial, which we know, especially through the Iliad and things like proper burials and taking care of the dead is very, very important. So whether or not that really means something later on or not, I don't know, but I flagged that as a proper burial per the request of him.
Right, and it's reminiscent from the Iliad for Patroclus, right?
Hmm.
Like, so here's the shade. Hey, I can't continue into my peace. I can't do what I need to do in the afterlife until you give my body the proper ritual. And so we are
Hmm.
seeing how important that is. Just if you kind of kick into like a moral lens, we're seeing how important that is for bearing the debt.
Now, can you imagine, like, what song is it that you would imagine being the most enticing song of all time? Like, what song would that be?
It's funny you mentioned that because I can't remember. Um, there was a king in mythology that asked his wise men this. The wise men thought they were very wise, and so he asked his wise men, "Oh, well, what was the song of the sirens? Right? What was this song that was so important? Right? That was
Mm.
so tempting the souls that basically the corpses of all these men that have jumped overboard litter their little island all around them." I
Hmm.
think my carve out question to that, and we'll kind of get to that point, but I think my caveat to that is that the song is different for each man.
Well, that's why I asked you. That wasn't
Well,
like a hypothetical, like over, like, big picture ideas. Like, no, no, no. What is the song for Deacon Harrison Garlick that
that's
is
going to make
so
me jump
enticing?
overboard.
Yeah.
Oh no, I don't know. I don't think I have a good. I don't know if I have a good answer to this. Do you have one that comes to mind for you?
No, no, I don't know. It made me stop and really think about, like, well, what would that actually be? Like, what is so alluring? But it reminded me. So remember, like, obviously, remember, this is a stupid way to start this. Uh, on the Easter Vigil, we have not said Alleluia for 40 days,
Mm-hmm.
and Easter Sunday comes, and all of a sudden, right before the gospel, you hear the organ just belting out. You hear the choir starting to sing up, and they're building up to this Alleluia. And they finally hit it, and they hit it at this high point, and it's this crescendo, and it kind of gives you chills down your spine and like goosebumps on your arms because it's like it's finally here. Like, Alleluia is our song. We're finally here. And like it just is like so encapturing, and it raptures you like into like this moment where it just is like full of ecstasy. Like that is, I guess, as close as I could possibly think of a moment that would just like enrapture me or capture me to that point. I don't know.
No, I think that's beautiful, and I think it's a drawing in of the soul, right? And I think we need to look at that very seriously, and also look at the lyrics. Like, what was it that they actually said to Odysseus? Because I think to kind of segue to your point, to step back to where I think we need to start the conversation is why does Odysseus need to hear the sirens to begin with?
Mm.
And notice that so this is the part of the passage we're in right now is Circe, right? This kind of witch character is explaining to Odysseus what he needs to do. And
Mm-hmm.
so this is probably line 55 or so.
Mm-hmm.
Notice that she simply just intuits what Odysseus wants to do. He doesn't say, "Oh, I want to listen to the sirens," right? She's
Mm.
explaining like, "Okay, you put beeswax in the ears of the shipmates so they can't hear, etc. But if you are bent on hearing, have them tie you hand and foot to the swift ship, right? Erect at the mast block, lashed by ropes to the mast, so you can hear the siren song to your heart's content." So one of the things that I was
Huh.
really questioning here is one, it's interesting to me that Circe just simply intuits that this is what a man like Odysseus would want to do. And the best that I came with to this is that we see Odysseus' spirit, right, his thumos, is willing to endure things for the sake of knowledge, right? He's known as being close to Athena. He's known as being this very crafty, wise character. And so here's an opportunity for him to have knowledge, to endure something, and he's going to seek that out, right? And I think if we can jump ahead, but I just kind of want to put a bow on this thought. If you jump ahead to then what the sirens actually sing to him, and this is on 200, the sirens then sing out to him, come closer, famous Odysseus. And they sing that they know about Troy, etc. But then they tell him, right, they're talking about different men. They say, until he has heard the honeyed voices pouring from our lips, and once he hears to his heart content, sails on, a wiser man. We know
Mm-hmm.
all the pains that the Greeks and Trojans once endured on the spreading plain of Troy when the gods willed it so. All that comes to pass on the fertile earth, we know it all. And so one of the things that I think is happening here is that we get an insight into Odysseus' character, that he is willing to undergo something that's dangerous, right? His thumos, that spirit is a thing in you that will undergo hardship, things that are arduous for the sake of glory, honor. Here, he is doing it for the sake of wisdom. And maybe
Mm.
knowledge. Wisdom, there's probably a very thick word, because we're thinking about wisdom from either a Catholic context or looking at wisdom back through, say, like Plato, Aristotle. But here, like this knowledge, like he's willing to be tied to the mast and undergo this for the sake of experiencing this thing. And then notice the Sirens, who basically are presented as omniscient, right? We know all things. Well, that's what he wants. He wants wisdom. And so their song, I think, is then tailored as a particular temptation for him, and even a temptation for why he's even tied to the mast in the first place.
Okay. So here's my thought. That's probably better than my thoughts. But when I was reading this, I saw it more as him not avoiding temptation and more of the vice of curiosity within Odysseus. That he desires to know things that are really kind of even out of his state in life, and he's willing to put himself into temptation, knowing that he has the warning that you may not be able to handle this. In fact, you've got to be tied up, both hands and feet, to make sure. And what happens? He can't even handle that. Like he's begging to be untied. And so to me, it's actually, like, as I read it, I saw it more as a lack of virtue here, like of being willing to put yourself into temptation and have the vice of curiosity of knowing something that isn't really pertinent to you, to in your state in life. You're just wanting the knowledge for the sake of the knowledge, just for the sake of being able to say, "Ooh, I know something about this," and it's kind of prideful. I don't know.
No, I'm not entirely sure how much daylight there is between your read and mine, because I feel like what your read then is asking the question is, okay, that's fine. He has the spirit to tie himself to the mast. He wants to experience this. He wants to have the wisdom. I think what you're asking is the next step, which is, was this a moral choice? Was this a good choice for him to do this? Like, is it good to expose yourself to that temptation? And I think your insight is correct, is that notice that had he not otherwise been tied to the mast, he would have jumped overboard and gone to them, right? He's crying out. Where is that? You mentioned it. He's crying out to them to untie him, right? Yeah, that's around 210 or so. And his men are actually good men, and they're jumping up and actually making sure that they're binding him faster once they see that he's actually lost his self-control. They're actually helping him. And I want to flag that for our conversation we had at the beginning, this kind of motif we're watching. I think what you're seeing here is the last kind of bastion of his men having an appreciation and a trust with him, because there's a huge trust factor here, right? They tie him to the mast. If they cut him loose in the midst of this, he's basically jumping overboard and he's dead, right? If they actually
how do they also hear him? They have beeswax in their ears.
Yeah, well, he's signaling to them, right? He says, "I signaled the crew with frowns to set me free."
Sure.
That's a good question, right? And so one of the things I'm tracking here is that, because I think the crew becomes more mutinous as they go on, that relationship is fractured. The book 12 actually starts with an act of trust between Odysseus and his crew. He trusts them to tie him to the mast, tie him well, even bind him when he starts to say, "No, let me go." And then they also still have an appreciation and an obedience to their captain to actually do this. I mean, if they wanted to mutiny, this is a wonderful time to do it, right? You don't even have to kill him yourself. Just let him loose.
Just let him do it. Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so a question that I have, though, regarding this. So, they give him, she gives him two options, right, of which to sail. The first option, it seemed like is it Jason? Is that right? Who it was that made it through the first option?
Yeah, Jason and the Argonauts.
Yeah, who's that? Like, where did that come from? Do you know?
Yeah, a few things here.
Because I don't have a good backstory on Jason. I didn't even know Jason was an ancient name.
I know, isn't that funny? Because we don't see Jason as being like an ancient name.
Yeah.
Like, and then the famous Greek warrior Kyle came
Right.
up, right? It's like,
Right.
no, we don't. I know Jason doesn't sound like an ancient name to us for whatever reason. Yeah, so Jason and the Argonauts are kind of a famous epic story even prior to Homer, but it only exists like in these kind of parceled out myths, right? We don't have like a great book like we do for like the Odyssey, the Iliad. So Jason and the Argonauts are going after the Golden Fleece, and so that's like their journey, right? They're going after the Golden Fleece, and so it mirrors a lot of the characters that are actually in the Odyssey are also in that. It's pulling from the same mythology, and so even like Jason and the Argonauts, when they have to go past the Sirens, if I remember the myth correctly, they handle it differently. They don't stop up their ears, and this might be interesting from a temptation standpoint, right? They don't actually try and stop the siren's song or their capacity to hear it. They decide that they're going to play a song more beautiful than the sirens. So they're going to actually focus on something more beautiful than what the sirens can actually offer, and that's how they make it past the sirens. And who does that? Um, is it Orpheus? I think it's Orpheus that sings this song or plays this song. So there is kind of a parallel in a lot of ways between Jason and the Argonauts, this other more ancient tale, and then also with what we're seeing in the Odyssey. Before we kind of, and you're correct, we also see Jason pop up again with like the clashing rocks. I think they're called the clashing rocks. Before we jump to that though, I want to round off a few things about the sirens. So the sirens, as we already picked up on, they're female mythical creatures. They sing. These men jump overboard, etc. A lot of times they're presented as half women, half bird creatures. I think you've alluded to that at the opening of the podcast. Notice Homer doesn't actually describe them. He doesn't actually give us any kind of description outside them being female. Later on, they're usually then depicted as naked, beautiful women, right? That are then singing these songs that lure sailors off, almost like a mermaid-esque kind of deal. But they're usually not presented in that way physically. And then later, kind of in the Western tradition, they tend to represent music, right? This beautiful song, right? That they have, sometimes even being connected to the song of like the cosmos, the song of the spheres. Plato will talk about this as well. So it's again, like we talked about, there's a very short passage here in the Odyssey that then has impacted our Western tradition and given it a lot of things to play with over several thousand years. The sirens just tend to capture our imagination. The things that on top of what we've already mentioned, the one thing that I would say that I'm most curious about with the song of the siren is we kind of have to keep in mind it's difficult because the chronology of the Odyssey of what events are happening at what times. And notice this book ends with him basically washing up on the shore of Calypso. And we don't get that story again. But if you remember the story of Calypso, he denies immortality. And we kind of asked ourselves, how could he do this? And we had some questions there about how that did. And I think there's good insight in that book with immortality being unnatural to man. And then we see he denies marriage to Nausicaa. Right. So now here's this natural temptation, if you want to call it that. And so I'm interested in the fact of, does Odysseus hearing the song of the sirens, this tempting song, being able to hear that and endure it? What I mean by endure is not necessarily survive the temptation, because he does signal to be set free, but he doesn't die, right? He's one of the few humans to live, but understand the song of the siren, this tempting song. Does that at all inform his capacity later on to say no to Calypso and no to Nausicaa? That he's already experienced what is the most tempting thing that we kind of see for him. And then does that actually allow him proportionally to say no to other temptations like Calypso and Nausicaa?
That's interesting because, he didn't actually say no.
To what, the sirens?
To the sirens.
Correct.
He begged to actually be, let free. So I don't know. That's a good question. I don't. My initial gut reaction is I don't think so, because I haven't seen him be able to, like, when put in that predicament, he hasn't shown self-restraint in that way.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, I don't know,
so
and
I
I
don't
don't know
know.
if there's a. I don't offer that. I'm not like putting that ball in a tee and then saying like,
Sure.
"Oh, look, here it is." I think it's one of those questions that we have to ask ourselves because I think for a lot of people, you can't still just deny that him denying immortality is a small thing,
No, I agree. I agree.
right?
I agree
I
with
mean, I
that.
think we can't just say, "Oh, look, it's he knows it's unnatural to man," and these kind of things. I'm not sure Odysseus does. Homer might know it is.
Hmm.
I'd be comfortable with that. Homer knows that immortality is unnatural to man, at least in the way that it's being given in this context, right? I'm not sure Odysseus does. And so I'm kind of looking for a way of like, I still am not entirely settled on how I think Odysseus has the capacity to say no to these things.
Hmm.
So it just strikes me that, like, well, here he endures, or I guess maybe survives might be a better word, this
Yeah.
heavy temptation. Is that song still resonating in his head as he embraces or is tempted by other temptations? And not necessarily maybe in um, a virtuous way that we would think about it in like a more
Hmm.
robust virtuous tradition,
Hmm.
but insofar as just like, you know, what is this temptation to me when I have already heard the sirens? So
Ooh.
not necessarily that he's actually like maturated and habituated himself to some type of like fortitude, not fortitude, but temperance, but
Hmm.
rather like other temptations now pale in comparison to the song that he's now heard.
The inverse of St. Thomas Aquinas no longer writing anything.
Yeah, sure, right. I mean, he already experienced like this greater temptation. So yeah, this is a question
That's
that I
interesting.
threw.
I like it. I like that thought. Yeah, yeah.
So
I like it.
let's jump to what you mentioned, which is because we kind of jumped ahead, but Circe right now is trying to tell him what to expect. And
Hmm.
so you are correct. She basically, I think people skip this part. They talk about the sirens, and then he has to go through Scylla and Charybdis, but he does have an option here, right? This is
Hmm.
like 65 or so. He has to decide for himself. And so this is, you can read this as this is a line of agency, right? You get to decide. Well, I'm not really sure he gets to decide because he either gets to go through the clashing rocks, which basically Jason and the Argonauts survived, but they only survived because Hera saved them.
Hmm.
So it's not clear to me like is that really a choice? Like is that really a choice?
Right.
Like hey, go to the clashing rocks where everything gets torn apart. Jason did it, but by the way, he did it because Hera saved him.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, my initial read there is that he may have actually wanted to, because just from the prideful, from just being like wanting to be one of the guys who were able to do it. But he also knows that Poseidon, like he and Poseidon aren't like BFFs. Like they're not inviting each other to their birthdays. And so Poseidon gets a little whiff of that, and it's all done. I
No,
don't know.
I agree. I think in certain ways there's a temptation there for Odysseus. So then if he can't go through the clashing rocks, he has to go through this other strait. And then so there's
Hmm.
a monster on both sides. So let's talk
Hmm.
about Scylla. Right. Let's kind of maybe
Scylla. It'd
Scylla.
be way cooler. Skillix. That'd have been way cooler.
That
Like
would
the
have
band.
been
Isn't that a band?
when you write
Isn't that
your own epic poem.
Skillix?
So let's talk about Scylla. Like who is she like in
Skrillex.
mythology?
That was it. Skrillex.
I'm just gonna move
Sorry.
on.
Yeah.
So Circe tells us that she is a grisly monster. She has
Hmm.
6 long swaying heads, and she is not immortal. She's an immortal devastation. Terrible, savage, wild. There's no fighting her, no defense. Just flee the creature. That's the only way. So the mythology on Scylla is really fascinating. So in some myths, well, I guess all the myths agree that Scylla at some point was not a monster. That Scylla was either a beautiful woman or she was a beautiful sea nymph. But in any way, she was basically turned into this monster. One of the myths, which is very detailed, states that Scylla was a beautiful sea nymph, and she was loved by a sea god named Glaucus. And Glaucus, he goes out, he tries to attract her, and Scylla is not interested in him. So what does Glaucus do? He goes to someone who makes potions and magic. He actually goes to Circe. And he asks Circe for a love potion, basically, right? Make a potion so she can love me. Circe then, which I think is fitting for Circe's character, right? If you remember how she first met the men and then also when she met Odysseus, Circe tries to seduce Glaucus. And Glaucus won't have anything to do with her because he is just head over heels in love with Scylla. Circe then, in her rage, doesn't do anything to Glaucus. She creates a poison and goes and poisons Scylla, this beautiful sea nymph. And in this poison, it turns her into this monster. It turns her into this six-headed... It says she has serpent-like necks, but dog-like faces. Right? She's this really grotesque creature that then in a lot of ways is basically transfixed to the side of the sea cliff. And so she just reaches down and grabs dolphins or creatures or whatever it is. And now she's this, immortal monstrosity that's attached to the cliff. And this longer, more detailed myth really caught my attention because that means it's actually Circe who created this monster. So when Circe is sitting here saying, like, nope, don't fight her, you can't fight her, like she's an immortal devastation, she's actually the product of Circe's own rage and cruelty.
I did not know that.
And I think that, moreover, then I think, how do you read then on like 135? Circe says, Scylla's mother, she spawned her to scourge mankind. She can stop the monster's next attack. Well, who is Scylla's mother? Well, the myths aren't entirely clear, so maybe this is like a Homeric thing that we're not quite sure anymore. But also, there can be, I think, a certain read in this of irony, where Circe is her mother, not of her originally, but a mother of her in her monstrous form.
Well, I'm glad you knew this because I actually marked that up to ask you, like, who is Scylla's mother, like, and what's the background there? So
yeah, I think this is a good thing about reading the great books, right? Is having the patience to go back and look up these references and say, wait, because then when you look at them, right, I think it gives a little bit more life to the text of like, okay, so now
is this where you got it from? Just for those who are watching.
Oh yeah. So you can find it all in our guide. Our question answer guide explains who Scylla is and who also Charybdis and who the Sirens are. The two texts that I have the most, you're doing a good job there, Vanna White. So the two texts I have the most recourse to are Edith Hamilton's Mythology and also the Oxford Companion of Ancient Mythology. I can't remember the name. I cite that one a lot in the guide too. Those are the two ones that I go to if I need help understanding the mythology.
But the first thing you should do is go check out our guide, because our guide is really the end all be all.
Yeah, it's a question answer format. I think it's very helpful. Okay, so let's talk about Charybdis, which is a word that sometimes when you look at it, you're like, wait, how do I pronounce this? So Charybdis. So Charybdis is the other monster. So if they're going through the strait, one side of the strait are the cliffs. Scylla is on that side with her heads reaching down to grab things. On the other side of the strait is this whirlpool monster. And so basically we don't quite know what she looks like. She's just under the water. And 3 times a day, she sucks down all the water into a whirlpool, eats whatever she gets, and then spits it all back up, right? So her mythology is not nearly as complicated. If I recall correctly, she's a daughter of Poseidon and Gaia, the earth. And this gives, by the way, if you ever heard, we don't use it as much now, but we say between a rock and a hard place. That's usually what we say now for our idiom. But a lot of times in older books, you'll see, this guy's in a hard situation. He's between Scylla and Charybdis, right? Because the question then is like, what are you going to do? If you try and chance the whirlpool, you might lose your whole ship, right? You might lose everything. Well, then if you go closer to Scylla, remember these ships are open, and so like you're only going to lose 6 of your men. She only has 6 heads, so you're going to lose 6 of your men. And this is basically what Circe tells Odysseus to do, right? It's better. This is like line 120. Hey, it'd be a lot better for you to lose 6 men than for you to lose your whole ship. And to Odysseus's credit here, he does ask her, right, can I fight back against Scylla? There's got to be a way to fight, but you can't fight back against a whirlpool. You can't fight back against Scylla. How can I do that? And that's around a little after 120. And this is where you get Circe saying, no, she's an immortal devastation, etc. I think it's more fascinating with Scylla's mythology whether or not Circe is even lying. Or whether or not if Circe, if she's that stand-in mother character, maybe she has a potion that could actually help Scylla. But she's not going to give it. So she actually just tells Odysseus, nope, you can't do anything about it. So I think if we're going to give a pro-Odysseus stance here, at least at this moment, he's trying to find a way to not lose his men, right? Hey, can I actually fight against her? And I think we could maybe question the degree that Circe's being honest when she actually gives him advice. He does take the advice. So if we look at 165 or so, I'm sure you noticed as a first-time reader, like this is one of the most classic examples in the text of Odysseus not telling the whole truth. Because it's interesting, it's Odysseus telling the story about how he heard something from Circe and retold it to his men. So he's got several stacks going on here. And so even in his own story, he's admitting, hey, guys, let's get together. It's not fair that only I hear about Circe. You guys should hear what Circe has to say too. He tells them about the Sirens. He tells them about Charybdis. He does not tell them about Scylla.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is where we're going to see the final fracturing of the trust between Odysseus and his men. So let's see. We went through the Siren narrative. Not sure I have anything else to add to that.
Can I go back just a little bit there?
Yeah.
About 150-ish. It's talking about how they could possibly, that you may leave your ship, and it says, but even if you escape, you'll come home late, all shipmates lost, and come a broken man.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was very interesting because that to me was the kind of the seal of the deal. That's not what we want. He wants, because I'm not sure at this point if he had the opportunity to lose all of his men but come home not a broken man, if he wouldn't do it. I don't know. I hope he wouldn't, but maybe he would. But I think that last caveat, that even if you do escape, like even if like the stars align and you do escape, you're going to come back a broken man. You're not going to come back the way you want to, coming back into the town like as a champion or as a hero or anything like that. You're going to come back as a broken man.
I like that. No, I like that a lot, because I like that juxtaposition that, like, well, actually, he might just take an option that he can lose all his men, right? He's been worrying about mutiny. He might take that option. I'm sure that there's probably a more pro-Odysseus stance that would say, no, he's not that cruel, but I do think he tends to use them as a meat shield at times. And so, no, I like that. So the you'll come home broken kind of stops him from making a completely selfish choice there, because he notices, no, it will hurt me as well.
Right. So I don't know. That was just
the other
my
thing
thought.
too that's not baked into this, that I guess right now in that kind of statement he doesn't know. But not only will you come home a broken man, but he doesn't realize that he's also then he has no ship, and so he will be exiled for several years with Calypso. Right? He's going to end up having to suffer through this. No, that's a good catch. I like that. So we talked about the Sirens. So now we're moving from Circe telling him what's going to happen to then actually moving through the narrative. We talked about the Sirens and raised good questions there. 230. So they've made it past the Sirens, and he's kind of giving there's his kind of like, rah speech to his men. Right? We got to make it past Charybdis. Don't be afraid. But he's not telling him about Scylla. I'm fascinated what you thought as a first-time reader. I found this little narrative that he gives almost comical. Right? He says, friends, we're hardly strangers at meeting danger, and this danger is no worse than what we faced when the Cyclops pinned us up in his vaulted cave with crushing force. But even from there, my courage, my presence of mind, and tactics saved us all.
Right. Yeah.
I think this is a little bit of revisionist history on there, right? He kind of forgets the part that he's the reason they got stuck in the cave in the first part. And then also the reason that they're being cursed now and having all these other arduous things is because he told his name to the Cyclops, and the Cyclops prayed to Poseidon. He's the central figure. Because again, everyone else got cursed because of what happened at the end of Troy by Athena. They have an extra curse on top of them because of what Odysseus did. He is very much the reason they are not home yet.
Yep. Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I think it's interesting that we have this Cyclops introduction and he kind of does this revisionist history right before the episode with Scylla, because even Homer makes this very explicit. Homer at like 240 says they snapped to each command, no mention of Scylla, how to fight the nightmare, for fear the men would panic, desert their oars, and huddle down and stow themselves away. Right?
Mm-hmm.
But now I cleared my mind of Circe's orders, cramping my style, urging me not to arm. So what's interesting here is, and I should clarify, it's not just Homer telling us this. Odysseus is actually telling his audience this. He's telling King Alcinous and his court that he's admitting that he did not tell them about Scylla. And I actually think that's fascinating. And I think we need to kind of lean into that and understand why. And so then he tries to give an excuse, right? For fear the men would panic and desert their oars and huddle down and stow themselves away, which means the ship is either going to stop moving, which they're going to probably be in more danger, or they're going to start drifting, which means they could go over to Charybdis.
Yeah, can I jump in here? Because I was a little maybe confused on this, because he asked if he could actually fight, and she said no, you can't. You can't fight. You're not going to win. And then he dons his heroic armor.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if I was Odysseus' man, I'd be like, hey, bro, like, I just saw you a second ago and you were just, in your regular clothes. And now all of a sudden you're in your armor. What's, you got something to tell me? Right. Is there something that I should be aware of? I found that to be very odd, especially because he knows he can't win there. So why the man of twists and turns? Why the man who is known, for his rhetoric and what is he trying to do here? I don't understand him donning his armor. I don't understand what he's trying to convey.
Well, I think there's a positive and a negative read. I think the negative read is what I had when I first read the text, which is that he doesn't want to be one of the 6 that are picked. So Scylla's going to look down on the ship, and she's going to pick 6 guys to eat. Are you going to pick the guy that is in armor holding spears when everyone else is just a shirtless guy over there with an oar that's completely defenseless? Mm-hmm. Probably not. So I had a very negative read the first time I read this. I found this to be against his character. I found this is another selfish choice. I like your imaginative exercise of thinking about the oarman looking up and being like, bro, why are you wearing all of your armor all of a sudden? We're fighting a whirlpool, right? Mm-hmm. There is a comical side to this, almost in a dark way. I think that's the negative side. I think the positive side is Odysseus in his spirit, his thumos, doesn't want to be conquered by Scylla. He does not. He's not giving in. So here his indomitable spirit has kicked back in again. And, hell with what Circe says. I'm going to fight Scylla. I will save my men. I will, I'll be damned if my men are going to be the ones that actually be grabbed off the ship, right? That kind of attitude. So he comes up, because he's not just in defensive armor. He also comes up, with a spear in both hands?
Seized right? in long spears, in both hands, and marched out ready. In a half deck.
So yeah. I think if I was going to give the positive read of it, the positive read is that, I'm going to do this, right? Mm. Hell or high water, I'm going to fight off Scylla, and my men aren't going to be lost.
So I think that's a very charitable read. Because, and the reason why I say that is because if that was really Odysseus's thought process, and he's like, hey, I'm going to win this, you're going to have a better shot at winning if all your men are armed, right? Not just you. Wouldn't it be better for all of you guys to be armed up, and fight?
Yeah, I think that's true. He
also, what kind of leader is it to be like, hey, I know some inside information, and I'm about to go to war, and you guys are just with your oars over there. I don't know. I guess I was just first time reader, right? So I'm just what captured my imagination there is I'm the oarman. I'm looking up at my leader, and all of a sudden I know he has inside information. He's playing inside baseball, and he comes out with 2 spears and all of his armor on, and he hasn't told me anything.
No, listen, I gravitate towards the more negative read here. I do. I'm trying, as I've mentioned before on this read, to have maybe a more positive read at times on Odysseus' character here. But no, the pushback on that would be, he thinks his men are cowards. right? If he tells them about Scylla, they're not going to be able to fight. They're
definitely terrified. I mean, they're like absolutely terrified, and I think the terror even compounds seeing that your leader has all his stuff, his gear on, and you don't.
Yeah, so I like these thoughts. Let's push into the narrative because I think there's more things to explore here. So Charybdis starts the whirlpool, right? And this is what I think we were talking about, that the men then are terrified. And then what ends up happening, Odysseus looks at the whirlpool and Scylla strikes without him being able to do anything, right? He's distracted. Right. So Scylla snatched 6 men from our hollow ship. This is right before 2-7.
He turns back around and was like, crap, dang it.
Gone. But one thing I want to note here that really, because this is a horrifying passage. I mean, just how it's described. There's lots of detail here, and so the first thing that caught my attention was the detail of the horror of the situation, mindset of what's happening right here, and that caught my attention then to how personable Odysseus describes this, and that's what I kind of want to point out here. So she grabs 6 men. Again, this is around like a little bit before 270. And he says, I can see their hands and feet already hoisted, flailing high and higher over my head, look wailing down at me, comrades, riven in agony. And this is one of the lines that caught my attention. Shrieking out my name one last time. Like his men are being like hauled up, right? Because at one point she's described like like a fisherman, right? She's like reaching down and pulling these guys up, and she's reaching down with her teeth, and she has these like dog face, sharp teeth, and she's gone down, she's grabbing these guys up, and they are calling out Odysseus's name as they're being eaten alive. And if you skip down a few lines, it says, so now they writhed, grasping as Scylla swung them up to her cliff. And there at her cavern's mouth, she bolted them down raw, screaming out, flinging their arms toward me, lost in that mortal struggle. I found that he describes this very personable. Because, I mean, you're getting eaten alive by a giant monster, right? Are you yelling someone's name? Do you have any clear direction of what you're flinging your arms to? But he says, no, they're calling my name, and they're flinging their arms towards me, even in the act of being eaten alive. That bolting down raw, right, is very reminiscent of the Cyclops narrative.
Yeah, so this goes back here. Here's my note on this. See lines 153. Because, and we already talked about this, right? His option is, even if you do escape, you come back home a broken man. How do you not come back home after that as a leader, a broken man in some way? Like the men that you were in charge of, as you witness, you see them, they're screaming your name and they're getting eaten alive and they're like grabbing for you, and you witness all of this. How does that not affect you as a man, especially as a leader?
No, I think you're right. I think there's what do we call it here? A psychological scar. Because if you look at 280, he says something that I think is very pertinent towards your insight. Of all the pitiful things I've ever had to witness, suffering, searching out the pathways of the sea, this wrenched my heart the most. And listen, that's a big statement for him. He has seen a lot of things. He's gone through Troy. He also saw his men be eaten by the Cyclops narrative, right? By the Cyclops in that narrative. I mean, that's not a small statement for him, given what he has seen. So there is a personal layer and veneer to Scylla that I think is really important. And I think it's not separable from the fact he doesn't tell his men about it. And I think in a lot of ways here, I think he is telling his audience, King Alcinous and his court, I think he's making this sound very personable to them, because I think it shows that he cared for his men, because he could be critiqued pretty heavily here, as we've critiqued him, right? That you haven't told them the truth. You didn't tell them the truth about Scylla. You're a bad leader. And I feel like he's trying to push against that, being like, well, Scylla did take them. I wasn't able to defend them. And I'm going to describe this in a very personable way to show you that I did care about my men and that this did affect me. Now, the skeptic in me then is how much of that is true.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Is that actually true? Like Odysseus really is psychologically scarred from this, which might be, there might be a too serious of a statement, but or is this really just a mechanism in storytelling to someone exonerate him from the fact that he didn't tell them about Scylla?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know.
Let me look at our guide real fast and see if I missed anything.
I'm very jaded right now, so like through the whole thing. So I know that there are other guys and gals listening right now, like screaming at us, being like, "You're not giving them the benefit of the," like I know that they're not happy about this. So I'm trying to temper myself in bashing Odysseus here. But I thought that was pretty tough.
It is. I think, again, like I said, I think book 12 is a book of broken trust. Yeah. And I think this is going to really lead into this. The only thing else I would mention on this narrative before we move on is that he loses 6 men here. He also lost 6 men with the Cyclops.
Right. Yeah.
And so they parallel each other. And remember, he started off this narrative recalling his leadership through the Cyclops. I very much think Homer is setting these two pericopes, these two little narratives together, and wanting you to compare them. And the question is, as you've already raised, is he a good leader?
Right. Now, this is the point of the book, though, that I pivot, and I pivot hard.
You really do? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's look into this. So then they come to the island of the sun, and this is where they have the cattle. Tiresias, the prophet in the underworld, told them about this. Circe also told them about this. Basically, everyone has said, if you go to this island, do not eat the cattle.
Right.
And if you do eat the cattle, well, actually, better not. If you don't eat the cattle, then you guys will make it home. If you do eat the cattle, then, if you do survive Odysseus, you'll be the only one, and you'll be a broken man. So it's noticeable here immediately that Odysseus then has them, basically the beginning is, well, let's not even go to the island. Right, that seems a simple fix. Just don't go to the island.
So this is the first point for me with Odysseus. Like, as a leader, this is something that you did not avoid temptation listening to the Sirens. However, this time for the whole, for the good of the whole, for the good of the common good, you realize like the best thing to do here is just avoid all temptation.
So you probably don't like Eurylochus.
No, I don't. However, I understand. I have sympathy for Eurylochus, knowing because he's exhausted, right? I mean, you just went through a psychological warfare of not knowing if you're going to die, not knowing if your ship's going to get wrecked. You've been on guard. Like, I understand you want rest. You're probably hungry. You're tired. I get it, and so I understand Eurylochus's desire, and I think there's some sympathy here of Odysseus finally saying like, okay, fine, we'll allow this. But Eurylochus continues to urge and asks, like, and as soon as he urges and he gets the shipmates to cheer and like get behind him, like as the leader, you're like, okay, well, as a servant leader, so to speak, this is what my men are wanting. We can do it, but then if that's the case, this is what we're gonna do. You guys have to promise me something else. Like I'll give to you, but there's a quid pro quo here. Like we'll do this for you, but then you have to do something back in return for me, which is an oath. Like don't eat that super good looking beef.
Yeah. It's funny how you can read these things. So it's interesting that Homer, but also Odysseus, because he's the storyteller here, he then actually uses the word mutiny, right? That they're actually being mutinous in their thoughts here. That Eurylochus is like, no, we need to stop on the island. We're broken. We're tired. What's interesting here too is like how much they're intuiting that Odysseus knew something about Scylla. Right now they're saying like, oh, is this why you came on with armor? Like I think there's, I don't recall a very clear line here where there's like a bell that rings, but I think they're very much intuiting, and I think they are over it. They are done. And you think about everything that's like gone on between the men. You think about go all the way back, like we had the Cyclops narrative, you had the narrative about the wind, right?
Mm-hmm.
Remember that? And
Mm-hmm.
they thought that he was stealing from them or not sharing like their proper shares. You get the what was that group called? The Lay Strygonians that was in the cove. Remember, it had the woman like a mountain crag.
Right.
But what does he do there? He doesn't tell his ships not to go inside the cove. He holds his only ship back. That's where he lost all of his ships but his. I mean, there's a lot of lack of trust. And I think Odysseus's leadership is highly called into question. And I think we saw foreshadowing of this when we did the Iliad, where Agamemnon would critique him every once in a while of saying, "Hey, why you seem like your strategies are you holding back and using other people as a meat shield? What are you doing here?" And so I don't know. I agree with you. I might push back and say the good choice, the choice of the good leader was not to go to the island, regardless of
Right.
what you say. Right. I mean,
However, like if you're all the like if you got another guy with mutiny on his mind and he's like, hey, no, let's rest, and then all the other guys are like, yeah, let's rest, yeah. I mean, like, that that's pretty tough to fight against when knowing that you're kind of on the brink of with leadership. It's like, okay, fine, I'll give you what you want. Just do something in return for me. Like, make sure you don't eat these cows.
right.
And so then they get hungry, obviously.
Well, I think even before that, I think that there's another thing here too about what is the relationship here between actual human agency, because we keep talking about choice, right? The choice of the men and the choice of Odysseus.
Are you talking about line 320?
Exactly. That's a great spot, because Odysseus then realizes, at least in his retelling, that there's some power there. And I wish I should have talked to Dr. Grabowski. He always helps us with our etymology there, because I was curious whether power was a daemon there. I'll have to ask him next time we see him, right? That again, there's this power, there's this spirit here that's working against them. And then you get to what you're talking about, line 350. So they go to the island, they land on the island, Odysseus acquiesces to his men, and then for a whole month, they don't have favorable winds. And this reminds me of that narrative, right, when the Trojan army was originally sailing to Troy, right, because the fleet had done something contrary to the gods, contrary to Artemis. She just doesn't give them a favorable wind. So here now, they haven't actually done anything yet. They haven't eaten the cattle, but it seems like some god or fate is setting them up to fail. Okay. And one thing I would really push on here, I mentioned this in the guide because I went back and found it, is you could say, well, no. Circe and Tiresias set this up as a choice. So maybe the gods are pushing him towards a certain choice. They want him to fail, but it's still a choice. There's still really a true choice there. But when I went back and looked, I want to recall back in book 2, if you remember, there is the bird sign, and like they're making fun of the old seer. The suitors are making fun of the old seer for reading this bird sign that Odysseus is coming back. And the old seer, this prophet, just mentions, oh, well, by the way, do you remember the prophecy I gave when Odysseus was leaving? And if you remember, he prophesies that Odysseus will come back by himself. Right? Basically almost tracking that by yourself broken man line, right? They're actually really parallel. So what's really fascinating here is like this whole thing is being pitched as an actual choice. Like, are the men going to eat the cattle? And even though Tiresias and Circe seem to present it as a choice, we already have a prophecy that Odysseus comes back by himself. So like, where is this interplay between fate and human agency in this text? Like, how much do we blame Odysseus? How much do we blame the men? And how much are they just playing out a role?
And then you see Odysseus go, and he wants to go pray. He goes and tries to pray, but then he falls asleep. And it's like, not the first time, if I recall correctly, that Odysseus falls asleep and things don't go very well.
No, I agree. I think that one way to look at this is, earlier we talked about sometimes Odysseus uses, or he could be accused of using, certain mechanisms to exonerate himself. And it's notable that Odysseus, in retelling a story to King Alcinous, tends to fall asleep at key moments that his men do tremendously stupid things.
Right.
And I think it might be one way to read that is it's another mechanism for exonerating him as the leader, right? Like, well, I would have stopped them, but I was asleep. That's
Mm-hmm.
not really being a great leader, but at least you can say, well, it wasn't me. I didn't have this to do, right? I was
Right.
asleep when they untied the bag. I was asleep when they decided to eat the cattle. But
Mm-hmm.
one thing about that, though, that I find bizarre is, well, first we get this wonderful narrative where they skin the cattle and they try and offer it as a sacrifice. I find this great, right? We're going to eat the cattle of the gods, but we're going to offer them as a sacrifice to the gods.
Mm-hmm.
They
Yeah.
don't
So,
have. Go ahead.
oh, yeah. No, I found this as like, your conscience is eating you up a little bit here. It's like they know they're doing something wrong. They made the oath. They made the oath to the leader. They decided to, like, he goes away. They decide to disobey, and so like they're trying to make it right by doing a correct. Uh, you know, the irony is very rich, and I like, to me it just reeked of your conscience is not very, is eating you up, and so you're trying to just do whatever you can.
Yeah, I agree. One thing to look about here too is that the object of the sacrifice is kind of an abomination. Like, really, you're going to offer the sacred cattle back to the gods that you're not supposed to touch. The object of the sacrifice is an abomination, but also they don't even do the ritual correctly. Like, they don't even have wine to pour out for libations. Like, so
Oh,
both
I
for
didn't
like
know. Oh yeah, it says, yeah,
390, I
yeah.
think they
They
have
had
the
no
water.
wine
Yeah,
to
excuse me, they have
anoint.
the wine.
Yeah.
So not only is the object of the sacrifice an abomination, but they don't even do it correctly. Right, the whole thing is an absolute loss. So, and then then we have the Odysseus sleeping narrative, and then we get Helios, that's the sun god, asking Zeus, and we get the gods kind of going back and forth. But what I really found fascinating, well, before we get to that, there's this comical thing where the hides of the cattle.
Mm-hmm.
Did you catch this? Like the hides of the cattle start to crawl, and the meat is basically mooing on
Mm-hmm.
the spit, right? This like immortal cows are somehow still immortal, even though they've been like dismembered and sacrificed. It's like this very bizarre scene. So keep that in mind. Odysseus is back. These cows are mooing from the spit over the fire. And then it just casually says, "Yet for 6 more days, my eager companions feasted on the cattle of the sun."
Yeah, this is in my mind, like I had the Moses coming down from the mountain, whole narrative, and it's like, wait a minute, guys, what do you do? Like, what? Why is there a golden calf here? Like, what? Wait, what are you guys doing? I told you I'd be right back. Like the 6th day, the whole 7th day. Like, it's very, I don't know. I thought that was very parallel. There's some parallels there, I guess.
No, I like that. I like that a lot. I think that's a good parallel of Odysseus just coming down and being like, "What are you doing? I would never do this. I told you not to do this.
Right.
X, Y, and Z." Except he's asleep. Yeah, up there on Mount Sinai, getting the 10 Commandments. So yeah, there's a certain. It's comical to me that it's like, no, we're so hungry, we have to eat these cattle, and then they're like doing these like comical but actually somewhat horrific things, like moving from the spit, and then you guys just continue to eat them for 6 days.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's not like they satisfied their hunger and then like said, okay, we ate what we needed to. Like, they just keep on doing it, right? There's this kind of like brazen fight against the gods. So what happens is the expected, right? So then the wind shifts, they get on their ship, and Zeus strikes them with a lightning bolt, and the entire ship is smashed apart, and basically everyone dies save Odysseus, and he's able to lash parts of the ship together, and then which I thought this was kind of a fascinating uh, part because I just wasn't expecting it the first time I read it. He drifts back over to Charybdis, and so we see that there is in the strait by Charybdis, there's apparently a fig tree that's actually kind of hanging over where her whirlpool starts. So as he starts to get sucked in, he grabs onto the tree, and then basically he can hold onto the tree until the whirlpool is done. She spits back out his raft. He can get back on the raft, and then he basically drifts over to Calypso's island. And that's where we pick up his story. What was that? Book 5?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Then we
Mm-hmm.
actually then pick up back in book 5.
Yeah, book 12 is very interesting, right? I mean, it has a lot going on. One thing we didn't mention is I believe this right. Correct me if I'm wrong here, Deacon, and you can edit this out or whatever if you want to. But I believe that a lot of the ancient pottery that you see depicted of Odysseus comes from this book, right? Of him on the pole being tied up. You see that. I think that's correct. That this is the depiction of him.
Well, these are the most famous narratives, right? The Siren, Scylla and Charybdis. I mean, these are all like some of the most famous things in mythology from his journey home are all jam packed here in the book 12.
Mm-hmm. I'm pretty positive I've seen this this very famous pot that is depicted of him, tied up to the pole, to the mast, and hearing all the sirens. But I mean, there's so much rich here. Like, I enjoyed this book as much as I kind of hated on Odysseus at the beginning, and then I hated on his crew at the end. I think it's very fitting that the book ends with him still being alone.
Mm-hmm. He's the broken man, right?
Because he's still the broken man. It's just, to me, it was just very fitting. I don't say that a lot of times because I don't, maybe not tracking it correctly, or I don't know. But for this book, I felt like, yep, that's how I would have imagined it going.
I think that just kind of one final point. I think how the book actually ends, right? So book 12, we both mentioned that he drifts back to Calypso's island, but 490, he breaks from his narrative to talk directly to King Alcinous, right? Saying, okay, well, I'm done with my story. And he presents himself as a storyteller who tells his stories clearly.
Mm-hmm.
And I just find that to be fascinating because we're sitting here saying, I don't
know.
So
clearly.
Yeah, I don't know if I really believe you. I don't really know if you keep falling asleep. I don't really know if you actually did these things. And it's, I don't really know, was it really this personable when your men were eaten by Scylla? And so he kind of ends this thing of just not only did I just tell a really good story, but I tell my stories very clearly.
Right. Yeah. It was a great book. It threw me for a loop though, because next week, as we will discuss, he gets back to Ithaca. It's what? We're only halfway through the book.
Correct.
Which threw me for a loop. So
yeah, it's even when I was rereading it this time, I kind of forgot that because so much of his journey home is all these kind of mythical island hopping,
right?
And all these things that happened to him. And halfway through the Odyssey, he ends up back on Ithaca, and now the entire half of the book is about him having to deal with the suitors and his relationship with Penelope. Yeah. So, I don't know. It's a good text. I hope everyone's enjoying it kind of as we work through this year of Homer. Please go on thegreatbookspodcast.com and you can find our question answer guide to help you through your read, help you with a small group. It's our heart to kind of help you guys understand the great books, and we're very happy that you're listening.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. Make sure, if you guys are reading it together, make sure you send us a picture of your event. If you have some good brews, some good drinks, good food to accompany it, we'd love to see it. We'd love to reshare it with everybody else. Make sure you follow us on Twitter. That's or X, throwing up the X. We'll see you guys next week.
All right, thanks, Adam.